Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world. With self-care strategies from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda, neuroscience, and beyond. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and transformation catalyst, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and a holistic health coach. As you know, if you listen to the show, Chinese medicine can be put to many uses. Acupuncturists can help people with all sorts of conditions, ranging from physical pain to insomnia to digestive issues to mental health, things like depression and anxiety. But a bit less well-known and more than a bit mind-blowing is that this medicine can also be practiced to help us evolve our consciousness and to facilitate personal evolution. With me today to help unpack this rich topic is internationally recognized scholar, practitioner, and teacher of Chinese medicine, Lonny Jarrett. I read Lonny Jarrett's book, Nourishing Destiny, when I was just starting out in acupuncture school, before I really even knew what Chinese medicine could do. And it was really pivotal in my understanding of this medicine as a true body, mind, spirit thing. If you've heard the show in the past, you may know that Chinese medicine is not just one big monolith, but that there are traditions within traditions, different philosophies and methods of practicing, and that one of the most widely taught and practiced forms, known as traditional Chinese medicine or TCM, actually had its spiritual dimension all but stripped out during Mao Zedong's rule. And its spiritual evolution pretty much doesn't fit very well with communist ideology. And TCM is overwhelmingly what is taught in acupuncture schools and what our national board exams are based on. So at the time, what I felt like I was learning in school was almost mechanical. In the spirit of the medicine that I was hungry for, I felt really fed by Lonny's book, Nourishing Destiny. So I would come home after like sometimes 12 hours of school and just savor this book. And though I ended up deepening my studies of Chinese medicine with a different teacher, 80th generation Taoist master Jeffrey Yuen, Lonny's book was so deeply nourishing to my destiny. Sorry, I couldn't resist the pun there. And I am incredibly honored to have him join me on the show today.
Hello.
Lonny Jarrett. Lonny, welcome. I know you have been active in the field of Chinese medicine since 1980. You're part of the first real wave of non-Chinese people in the U.S. to study and practice the medicine. You helped found the Acupuncture Society of Massachusetts. You've got a master's degree in acupuncture and neurobiology and fourth degree black belt in Taekwondo. You moderate NourishingDestiny.com, an online community of over 3,000 practitioners dedicated to evolutionary, ecological, and integral perspectives on Chinese medicine. It is such a privilege and honor to have you here today with me. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
To start off, let's lay a bit of groundwork to help make this conversation a bit more accessible to the non-Chinese medicine practitioners who are listening. If you could start by explaining how it's even possible that an acupoint or an internal organ system has anything to do with consciousness or personal evolution, like the Cliff Notes version.
Well, I suppose the Cliff Notes version would be that the foundation. So we can talk about medicine as it's practiced in the gross realm, which would be body, and we could extend it to include the ego, the aspect of mind that orients us in time and space. But medicine can also be practiced in the subtle realm of soul and the causal realm of spirit. It can be practiced at the level of witness, and it can even be has non-dual dimensions to it. So when we're dealing in the strictly physical realm, intention plays relatively less of a role in healing. In other words, if I'm in a car crash and I'm rescued by a medevac that takes me to a hospital and they're doing surgery on me, my intention has relatively less effect in the outcome of whether I live or die. And it will certainly have an effect if I live on my long-term recuperation and in terms of what I make of the experience. But when we're practicing medicine that's holistic and integral medicine meaning a medicine that leaves no dimension of the self behind, then the foundation, one of the pillars of the medicine, one of the foundations of efficacy in the medicine is the patient's intention. How do they think about what they're doing? What's their motivation for doing it? What do they want? What are their goals? How important are those goals to them? How serious are they about those goals? So intention is the foundation of holistic medicine, really. Both the intention of the practitioner and certainly the intention of the patient. You know, people call me and they say, can you help me stop smoking? Can you help me lose weight? I say, do you want to stop smoking?
Right. It's pretty important to have that initial alignment. Obviously, yeah. Like, what are you willing to do?
Right. Well, if you want to, then absolutely this medicine has the potential to support that intention. And if you don't want to, then no medicine is going to help you because you don't want to do it. So my asking of that question is a subtle and not so subtle way of reinforcing what is hopefully the person's intention and calling in the first place. So intention, of course, implicates consciousness. Intention is one of the capacities of consciousness. Consciousness can perceive, meaning it can witness. Consciousness can make choices, and consciousness can set intention.
All of these things are true. And so you mentioned, obviously, the patient has an intention. The practitioner also has an intention and a role to play here. I'd love for you to speak to that, like that our role as practitioners ideally is what?
Well, I would say in the context of integral medicine, the foundation of a practitioner's efficacy is their own integrity as a living embodiment of the kind of wholeness that the medicine predicts is possible.
So we have to really walk our talk. It's not enough to just sling needles and prescribe herbs.
Right. And I find that for most practitioners, even fairly accomplished ones in the medicine, or rather than accomplished, perhaps I should say experienced, that Chinese medicine is a big idea, a set of theories that are applied to the patient as an imagined other. And I would really think that we need to be the kinds of practitioners who demonstrate a kind of wholeness, a kind of, if you will, a radical integrity that's inspiring to the patient and catalyzes an effect in them prior to the delivery of needles, prior to even speaking a word, that the upright forces in ourselves, the authentic self, the upright forces that sustain the authentic self, the Jing, Qi, and the Shen, have been integrated and marshaled and understood and recognized as a locatable dimension of our own self to such an extent that they inspire through resonance the upright forces in the patient who feels them, consciously or unconsciously. And in experiencing the rectification, the arising of those forces into awareness or subtly into the subconscious, this is going to set up a kind of friction between the upright forces that are striving to assert themselves and move the person to higher and deeper states of awareness and stages of development, and all the forces of ego, inertia, and resistance within them. And we use the medicine to diagnose the degree, nature, location, and place of that conflict within the self. And we have two avenues of intervention open to us. We can help eliminate stagnation, which means diminishing the presence of what is not real. And we can tonify the presence of what is real. The Zhong Qi, the authentic Qi, the upright Qi, the true Qi, the cultivated manifestation of Jing, Qi, and Shen, bringing that into the world. And we need to be living examples of that to the extent that our presence catalyzes the emergence of that within the patient, and especially to the extent that who we are as human beings either makes it impossible or at least significantly challenges the cynicism of the patient in regard to their own capacity to become a higher, more deeply evolved self.
So we need to believe in their health and wholeness. We need to be able to take a stand for that and to help the person get rid of or transcend that which is keeping them stuck in a false sense of self?
Well, I think it goes very much further than belief. As you said, we need to embody this.
Yes.
So it goes very much further than belief. And one of the capacities that I think an evolved and accomplished healer would embody is the ability to recognize imminent but as of yet unmanifest potentials within the patient, and to be able to understand the ways in which a patient frames their experience, the way they think about their experience, and the way their worldview limits the manifestation of these potentials, as well as the degree to which physical stagnations in the body and subtle stagnations in the mind and in the condition of the soul prevent the manifestation of these potentials. And it's our job to be able to see them. And if we've done our own work in our own cultivation, we will have had to make sacrifices sufficient in our own life for the sake of realizing the higher potentials that we've awoken to, so that we know what it takes to do that, what it means in this, what kind of sacrifices are necessary, and what it means to overcome our own cynicisms and forces of inertia, so that we have no single doubt of the patient's capability to do this too, if only they care enough, if only they're willing.
You mentioned that integral medicine means no part of the self left behind. And
Yes.
I'm curious about what parts of the self are you including here? What exactly do you mean by that?
Oh, well, from an integral perspective, we can look at the self in terms of states that we experience. So, gross, subtle, causal, witness, and non-dual states. We can look at the self in terms of stages of development. So you mentioned acupuncture point function before. It might be evidence to the audience that a point like gallbladder 40, which is the source point on the gallbladder channel, its name is Wilderness Mound. It's located by the lateral malleolus, in the depression just distal to the ankle bone. And Wilderness Mound speaks to, its capacity to help a patient involve a greater perspective. In essence, to take them up a hill so they can get a 360-degree perspective on where they've been, where they are, where they're going when they've lost perspective. Now, it's not going to enact those potentials in a 3-month-old, because a 3-month-old does not have a mind.
Right, exactly. So using
they haven't gained perspective yet, so they haven't lost perspective. So since it takes a practitioner of a certain state and stage development to be able to recognize the capacities of the medicine they're prescribing, just like a text, like the Tao Te Ching or the Nei Ching Su Wen, the book is going to reflect the value system, the world space, and the quality of consciousness of who's ever reading it back to them.
Absolutely. And so just to unpack a couple things here, so what Lonnie's saying is that that gallbladder 40, this point on the lateral ankle, that first of all, it is a point that has an effect on the physical body as well as on our perspective, our ability to see ourselves in a new way. And so a practitioner can be using this point for ankle pain or something very physical to help you climb a hill, or it can be used in this more metaphorical sense of helping you gain a perspective on your life. But if the practitioner doesn't know that it's possible to use the points in that way, it's not going to have that effect. And that comes back to our personal cultivation and intentionality.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it won't have that effect. I would say that the practitioner won't be able to recognize it and therefore provide the appropriate signifier to the patient for their experience. In the 3-month-old, the point might be effective in treating jaundice, but because the infant lacks a human mind, it's not going to have the infant lacks the subtle development necessary for the manifestation of the higher and deeper potentials of the point. So moving on, we have state development, we have stage development, we have lines of development within us. And these lines of development can be at all different levels in an individual. So we have a sexual line of development, an ethical line of development, physical line of development, a musical line, a mathematical line, an intellectual line, a creative line, a relational line of development. We can talk about ego development. We can talk about soul development. And all of these different lines in a given individual can be at different levels of development. So it would not be unusual, for instance, to listen to the music of a musician who, in their musical and creative line of development, was channeling something from the seventh, eighth chakra, some very high witness or non-dual subtle experience. We might even feel a connection to God through their music, but at an ethical level of development, the person's life could be a complete mess.
Yeah, and that absolutely is the fact that these are orthogonal lines, right? Just because we excel in one area of life doesn't mean that we've developed or have that same ability in all levels. And that I think about Ken Wilber's distinction between waking up and growing up, as a nice succinct way of putting that, and the dangers really of having kind of a peak experience, or like, getting to an advanced stage of meditation where you feel like you're a Satori experience where you're one with all that is, and then thinking that means that you know everything, right? And that,
right, which would be arrogant. So waking up is state experience, growing up is stage development. Higher state experience can reveal higher potentials to us, but it takes work to enact those as stages. And it's arrogant to think just because we're having a very high experience that it means something about us. The highest experience any human being can have is just an experience of actually what's already true.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that we know how to get there, and just that feeling of being of oneness doesn't necessarily mean that we're embodying the values that go along with that.
Well, yes, that's a lifetime. That's a many lifetime goal. We can be profoundly inspired by the Bodhisattva vow and give our life to it. But the better part of humility is the recognition that it will take lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes. One thing that comes up from what you just said is that it's part of our function as healers to provide signifiers to patients for the experience that they're already having. I'll give you an example. For many years, I would walk down my driveway and I'd see these little mushrooms on the side. I've lived in the house here since 1991. And 4 years ago, I took a picture on my iPhone and sent it to a friend who's an expert. And he said, "Oh, those are morel mushrooms." And so now for 3 weeks every May, I collect the morel mushrooms. Well, the mushrooms existed for those 3 weeks every year for the 27 years, 28 years I've lived in this house. But a practitioner of mushrooms provided the signifier for me for the experience I was already having, so I could make distinctions. In the same way, Buddha nature is already in, and the witness and the subtle soul is already in everybody's experience. It's just that people don't have signifiers for it. And because we live in such a superficial materialistic culture, through genetic and cultural habit, awareness is entrained onto the physical and psychological dimensions of the self. And people identify with those dimensions. So people are deeply and profoundly identified with the physical sensations in their body and with their emotions and with their thoughts. And all of those are integral dimensions of the self. There's no problem with any of them. It's just that when consciousness and awareness is constrained to only thought, feeling, emotion, and sensation, and we're leaving out the soul, the conscience, the witness perspective, when we're leaving out our non-dual experience of self as the cosmos with a capital K, meaning the entire interior and exterior dimension of all that is and all that is not. When we're leaving out all of that, we tend to have the experience we tend to live life in an inherently limited context defined by the experience of suffocation and having there be an existential problem at the root of self, the sense that there's always something at the root of self terribly, terribly, terribly wrong, which needs more time to heal. And that time is never going to be now. It's always going to be after our next meditation or in some future darshan or after the next acupuncture treatment or the next ayahuasca ceremony or the next tantric session. Then we'll be whole, but never right now.
That's, I think, a really profound idea, right? That healing could exist right now in this moment without anything changing.
Well, I think it goes beyond that. I'd like to take it one step further to there's a significant dimension of ourselves where nothing's ever happened. Nothing is happening and nothing will ever happen. And that dimension we can describe as emptiness and luminosity. And the dimension that's empty is the ground of being, the unborn dimension of the self that never entered the stream of becoming. It's unborn and it's undying and it's eternal. It's what L.Ac called Chan, the constant Tao, the eternal Tao. And then there's an explosion coming out of that. And that explosion is relentless. It's a ceaseless movement toward the true, the good, the beautiful, toward manifesting in creation that profound depth that we experience in emptiness, and then actually manifesting that in creation in a way that catalyzes the emergence of more profoundly and deeply integrated vehicles for the transmission of spirit into this world, into creation. And from that, when we wake up to that perspective, that dimension of the self, we transcend healing. Medicine no longer becomes about healing, but it becomes about evolution. It becomes about, because we've recognized the dimension of ourself that isn't wounded, isn't traumatized, isn't victimized, has nothing to overcome, and is ready to live fully now for the sake of expressing spirit as consciousness in this world, for the sake of self-knowledge, for the sake of waking up and growing up. And the other is cleaning up, which means when we wake up and grow up, we need to clean up, which means take responsibility for karma that we've created. And we need to show up, which means we need to engage in the world as an active force, as a vortex and catalyst of change, of creative change in the world. And none of that is to deny the dimension of ourself which is wounded, which has suffered possibly horrific trauma, but just to not be defined by that trauma. And, I start my second book saying we can consider a person healed when they can look at themselves in the mirror and without blinking an eye to eye, know that they changed nothing that ever happened in their life if it meant not being there now. And realizing that all the suffering they've ever experienced has brought them to a place of compassion and humility where they can actually be useful to other people in terms of helping them transcend and overcome their own suffering and awaken to their own minds and bodies as vehicle for the expression of the true, the good, the beautiful.
Yeah. This episode of A Healthy Curiosity is brought to you by my Basics of Chinese Medicine, Your Inner Ecosystem course. If you're curious about the energetic anatomy of your subtle body, the 5 elements, the psycho-spiritual dimensions of your internal organs, and how to align with the rhythms of nature, this course is for you. How cool would it be to know what point you could press on to calm yourself down or make a headache go away, or to stop gas and bloating and drop extra weight easily when you understand the body clock, digestive fire, and the energetics of food as medicine? Looking through the lens of yin and yang and the 5 elements, you'll see yourself and the patterns that you use to stay safe in a whole new way, so you don't have to be bound by them. If you're looking for more tools for your self-care toolbox and a framework for personal evolution, this Learn From Anywhere course is ready whenever you are. This course provides a deep dive into Chinese medical theory without having to enroll in acupuncture school or get lost in a sea of jargon. I make these teachings accessible and fun without dumbing it down. Just head to the classes and meditations page at brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. And enroll. Now back to the show. It sounds like you're describing a real radical acceptance of everything that has ever happened to us in life, that when we can own that fully and recognize that, like, yeah, all this has happened, I'm good with it. And it's made me who I am today. And it allows me to show up and to be a stand for that for others and in the collective, that's potentially an image of what we could look like as someone who is healed.
Well, yes, and heal to me means the emphasis moves from healing, which is a self-centered motive, to actual evolution,
which transcends the self, right? Like that, everything that it's as we are both in Chinese medicine, right? This idea of microcosm and macrocosm, that everything out there is also in here in each of us, that there's this individual, there's internal, external, there's individual, there's collective, and we're all of it.
Yeah. And to go a little further, that there is no out there and in here.
Sure. Yeah. If in a non-dual perspective for people who are
the non-dual perspective.
Yeah.
So Chinese medicine has 13 perspectives. We have 0, which is the ground of being. We have 1, which is the explosion coming out of the ground of being. We have yin and yang, the 3 heater, the 4 divisions of heat, the 5 elements, the 6 stages of cold, the 7 pathogens, the 8 principles. We have the 3 heater, 3 times 3 is 9. And so the 9 divisions of the body. We have the stems and the branches and the 12 officials. So we have these 13 views, 0 through 12. And to understand the next 12 of them, you have to have a living experience. Non-duality is the foundation of everything else that comes. And without authentic, not just non-dual experience, but actually having non-duality be a locatable dimension of the self and of the patient, and experiencing the transpersonal domain between the self and the patient that we give birth to in relationship, in non-dual relationship therapeutically. Without that, everything else tends to be relegated to theory and technique, which is rather exists in the mental egoic domain and is rather abstract.
So practitioners who may be listening to this saying, okay, I'm with you. I want to exist in this space where it's not me and the patient, but that we're all of this field together, and that we are beyond the sort of ideas of separate self, and that we're there. Somebody can identify with that as an ideal, but recognizes that that's not how they're currently practicing. What step do they need to be taking in order to bridge that gap between how they're maybe practicing now versus this vision?
Well, like anything, you have to find a teacher who's tread the domain and has some understanding of it and some reasonable measure of victory in relationship to it. In terms of the transpersonal realm, it takes at least 2 to tango. So the thing is that the practitioner, the patient, their reason for coming may have nothing, and likely has nothing to do with most of what we're talking about, unless you live in Boulder, Colorado, Oakland or Berkeley, California. There are few communities around the country where people may share these values, as central values in the community. But I think it behooves the practitioner to have experience in the subtle soul realm and have experienced witness in the causal realm. These are gotten through serious meditative practices, cultivational practices, qigong, cultivation, meditation. There are medicine circle practices that people can engage with that open up the subtle realm, and then meditative practices beyond the subtle into the witness and the causal and non-dual realms. I think that a practitioner really has to have some degree of experience, and not just experience, but actual development in these realms to be able to practice what we call holistic medicine.
I really agree. People ask, how do I find a good practitioner near me? And really, it's like that. My recommendation is always like, ask them about their personal development. Ask them what they do but what they consider a prerequisite for showing up in the clinic. Do they meditate in the morning? Do they take the time? Like, are they living in integrity with these values of wholeness that are so central to Chinese medicine?
Do you think the average practitioner would be capable of answering the question honestly? I mean, it seems to me most people would say, well, sure I do. I wear Birkenstocks and I have chi pants and I drink green tea. I light incense. There was a question on acupuncturists on Facebook a few years ago, which I monitor to keep my finger on the pulse of the profession. And somebody said, how do I protect myself from my patient when I enter the treatment room? And, people were saying everything from, you bang a gong, or you do this meditation practice, or you light incense, or you smudge the room before and after every patient, and people were recommending astragalus and all these things to take and all these things to do. And I just said, forget it. What we're talking about here is immunity, and immunity is the sum total of your entire life, of all your behavior, all your belief, and your entire life experience and your relationship to it. Your immunity is how your consciousness, consciously and unconsciously, is drawing the boundary between self and other.
Right. You're going underwater with your patient. You're not like, there's nothing to be that we necessarily need protection from. It's
there may be. I mean, from people sneezing on you to
sure.
to more subtly corrosive entities that might be looking out through those person's eyes. But the point, people have this idea that, I leave my stuff outside the treatment room and my treatment room is my altar. Well, forget that. To quote Buckaroo Banzai, wherever you go,
there you are. Yes, indeed. And so one of the things that I obviously on this podcast, I try to get real with people about what I'm struggling with and my own personal foibles and like how I'm doing it. And in the treatment room, it's like the idea of being able to listen to where somebody's at and really get a sense of what needs to shift in maybe their lifestyle, their diet, their attitude, their beliefs, whatever, that helping somebody see that and figure out kind of like what needs to change in order for things to feel better, in order for things to be in harmony, in order for the body and mind to come back into balance with itself. So as part of that, it's like a lot of times I will explain to patients why I'm using a particular point. Or like I'll tell them a little bit about my intention behind it. I'll give it a sense of like this particular point. I think of of the points as like friends, with like little, like the superpower of this friend is, like what they're especially good at is, and give people a sense of my intentionality around it. And it's almost, I don't know, I feel like it's almost a ritual, where it's like then placing the needles, it's taking on this quality of like, I'm tapping into this for this particular purpose. But everything, including morphine, works better when the person who's taking it understands why it's being administered. And so bringing the person's consciousness on board as I'm practicing is something that is, I guess, a habit at this point, and something that a lot of my patients really appreciate knowing. I'm curious if that's in your style of practice. Like, do you tell people why you're enlisting the points that you're choosing, or the strategies that you're employing? How important is it for them to know what's going on, and for everyone to be on the same page, not just in a sense of in an energetic field kind of a state, but in an actual conversational, understanding, intellectual sense?
Yes, so sure. The first time that I see someone, I spend an hour and a half to 2 hours with them.
Mhm.
The first 45 minutes is asking questions and listening. Then I listen with my fingers by taking their pulse for 20 to 30 minutes, sometimes 40, depending how much is there to be seen, and notating the pulse. And then I look at their tongue and I look in their eyes. And then we spend a good 15 to 20 minutes or so with me explaining to a person just what I've seen. And I try to make a link to them between their thoughts, what they believe, how they behave, and the symptom they're complaining of, so that they can understand that their symptom is the tip of an iceberg that is directly linked to the way they're thinking about their world and the way and the position they're taking in relationship to their life. I don't tend to use any of the technical language of Chinese medicine in my practice. I doubt in my 34 years of practice the word qi has come up more than a few times. I tend to speak to people in metaphors that are going to be meaningful to them in a way that the metaphor itself is delivered as medicine that can help to start dissolving the dysfunctional relationship they have between their own attention and their thought, feelings, emotions, sensations, and conclusions that they've drawn in their life. So I speak in a language that's going to be highly meaningful to them. I may say, I certainly now and then may say this point is called soul burial ground, or this point is called wilderness mound, or this point is called rooted in spirit. So I may speak to them that way, but I may also just give an image and say something like, this point is just to expand perspective, to help you get clear on where you've been, where you are, and where you're going.
But you will tend to bring them to your side of the lens in a sense of like, this is the goal here. This is what we're trying to do.
Well, I'm doing that subtly with every word and with every glance and with everything that's done all the time on a scale from incredibly subtle to saying something like, if you don't do this, I think your condition could kill you.
Not really messing around. They're pulling punches. That's great. For people who might be curious as to like, why is he taking a pulse for 20 to 40 minutes? Could you explain that a little bit to folks who might be not familiar with all that we can potentially discern from a pulse from a Chinese medicine perspective? And I know you study a particular kind of pulse diagnosis that is like that. Well, your practice is heavy into pulse diagnosis, whereas for other practitioners, they might not take the pulse at all in favor of other diagnostic methods. But
here,
yeah.
So I first learned pulse in 1980, which means I've now been doing it for 39 years. The first system I learned was the Nanqing pulse system, which is a very simple pulse system, at least as it's generally taught and understood, which is very good for determining relative excess and deficiencies in the channels in terms of the flow of qi and where it's excess and deficiency. And the other system I learned is the Shen Hammer system. And I studied a bit with Dr. John Shen, but mostly with Leon Hammer. I spent 10 years with his main student, Leon Hammer, who's now 94, and just released his 5th or 6th text. I endorsed one for him last year, and a new one just came in the mail 2 days ago. A beautiful book. So he's still quite productive. And this is a very sophisticated pulse system, recognizing now 85 up toward 100 qualities. To be perfectly honest, I use about 50 to 60 qualities on a daily basis. And there are about 50 positions to put your finger in if you parse them all out, and 8 to 9 different depths on the pulse. And taking the pulse gives us estimate of the functional state and stage development of all the organs. The state, the physiological state of each organ, as well as the whole human organism in the moment, as well as the state in terms of progression of degree of health and progression of illness in the different organs and body systems, not just physically, but in the subtle realms as well.
So much that we can glean potentially if we know how to pay attention.
Well, the great victories that I've had, would be an example would be a student in class asking, me just taking her pulse in the class for a 30-second pulse diagnosis as I go around and take everyone's pulse with the goal of just identifying a few qualities that everyone can feel. And with this particular individual, I just said to her very quickly, I think you have something growing in your upper right quadrant. I think you need to get some imaging done there. And this particular woman, she got a mammogram, which revealed nothing. So she paid $1,600 for an MRI, which revealed 3 spots of stage 0, very, very aggressive cancer. And they gave her a double mastectomy and found these spots throughout both breasts and said, by the time we knew you had this, it would have likely metastasized through your whole body.
That is amazing.
So Chinese medicine, in order to realize the potential of Chinese medicine as a truly preventive medicine, unless you're actually authentically psychic, which I think describes very few of us in terms of being gifted as geniuses in the psychic realm, I really think that pulse diagnosis is absolutely imperative to realize the potential of Chinese medicine as a preventive medicine.
Well, and one of the hardest to learn because typically we only have, not many of us necessarily pursue, we only have a certain amount of time in school where our mentors and teachers are able to show us. And it's the kind of thing
most schools have no meaningful teaching of pulse diagnosis.
Yeah.
And 2 reasons for that are most of the schools are focused on integrative medicine now and not on Chinese medicine on its own terms of its own strengths. And also there are very few of us capable of actually teaching the pulse at the level I'm talking about. There are more of us now than in the West than there have been before. And let me say there are very few in China. I mean, pulse diagnosis is a dead art in China, so it's not like it's prolific over there. The good news is that Leon Hammer's pulse book, his huge pulse book, is being translated now into Chinese.
Fantastic.
So the Dharma comes from the East to the West, gets upgraded through postmodernism to the integral level, and then goes back to China.
Beautiful. And I'm so glad that this knowledge, which is so essential, is being preserved in this way. And thank you so much for your contribution in preserving it. That's huge.
Yeah.
I know that you take people, you train practitioners, you have an online community. Do you want to say a little bit about how people might connect with you in that way?
Oh, sure. Well, a few ways. All of my books can be found at spiritpathpress.com. So Spirit Path, which is the English for Shendao, which is the name of an acupuncture point, GV11, spiritpathpress.com. So my books can be found there. I have an online community at nourishingdestiny.com with continuing ed courses there that people can take. All the discussion groups are free, and I'm happy to answer any questions pertaining to my work or Chinese medicine at large there. I moderate a group for several thousand practitioners on Facebook called Chinese Medicine Scholar Physicians, which is just dedicated to scholarly questions and clinical questions regarding Chinese medicine, but because it's both the physician part, which would be clinical, and the scholarly part. So bringing scholarship to bear on clinical questions. My teaching can all be found at www.chinesemedicine.courses. I teach a 2-year class. The class for 2019 is filled up. And the next 2-year class I'm giving is in Oakland, California in 2020. And that's sold out in 10 days. So if people are interested in taking the 2-year class, they should certainly drop me an email at Lonny, Lonny, at nourishingdestiny.com.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us today and sharing your wisdom. I'll make sure that links to all of that get into the show notes so that people can find them readily at my website at brodywelch.com. And yes, again, thank you so much for being willing to unpack some of these under-discussed topics about the potential of what Chinese medicine can do for people.
Yeah, Brody, it was fantastic being here. And I just want to say I get interviewed a lot, and you did a fantastic job. Your own depth really comes through in the questions and the interaction, and I just really appreciated that.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for listening today. To check out the show notes, get on my email list, or drop me a line, head to brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something new or feel inspired to try something different in your life, I'd love for you to pay it forward by sharing this episode with a friend who you think could also benefit, and give them a reason to listen. You'll be helping to create a world where we encourage each other to embody self-respect. Till next time, be good to yourself.